On the evening of November 9, 1989, East German government spokesman Gunter Schabowski sat before a room full of journalists at a press conference in East Berlin. It had been a routine briefing about new travel regulations. Near the end, an Italian journalist asked when the new rules would take effect. Schabowski shuffled through his papers, clearly confused. He hadn't been properly briefed. He looked down at the document in front of him and said, "As far as I know, it takes effect immediately, without delay." Those words, spoken almost by accident, would change history. Within minutes, news spread across both halves of Berlin. The border was open. East Germans could travel to the west. Immediately, thousands of people rushed to the checkpoints. Border guards, who'd received no orders about this, didn't know what to do. The crowd swelled. People were crying, shouting, demanding to be let through. And just after 11 p.m., at the Bornholmer Strasse crossing, a border guard made a decision that his superiors hadn't authorized. He opened the gate. The flood began. And by morning, the Berlin Wall, the most infamous symbol of the Cold War, was coming down. This is the story of how a wall that had divided a city for 28 years fell in a single night. How a bureaucratic mistake sparked a peaceful revolution. And how the Cold War, which had threatened nuclear annihilation for decades, ended not with a bang but with Germans dancing on top of a concrete barrier, taking sledgehammers to the structure that had imprisoned them for nearly 3 decades. To understand the fall of the wall, we need to go back to its beginning. In the aftermath of World War II, the victorious Allies divided Germany into 4 occupation zones. The Soviet Union took the eastern portion. The United States, Britain, and France divided the western portions among themselves. Berlin, the German capital, sat deep inside the Soviet zone. But the city itself was also divided into 4 sectors, with the Soviets controlling the east and the Western Allies controlling the west. This arrangement worked, barely, until 1948 when the Soviets blockaded West Berlin, cutting off all land access in an attempt to force the Western Allies out. The Berlin Airlift, one of the greatest humanitarian operations in history, kept West Berlin supplied for nearly a year until the Soviets backed down. But the incident made clear that Berlin was the front line of a new conflict, the Cold War. By 1949, Germany had split into 2 countries. The Federal Republic of Germany in the west, a democratic capitalist nation aligned with the United States and Western Europe, and the German Democratic Republic in the east, a communist dictatorship under Soviet control. Berlin remained divided, an island of Western democracy surrounded by communist East Germany. For East Germans, this created an escape route. Berlin was the one place where crossing from east to west was still possible. The border between the 2 halves of the city existed, but it wasn't sealed. People could move between sectors, though it was discouraged. And hundreds of thousands of East Germans took advantage of this. They'd travel to East Berlin, then simply walk or take the subway into West Berlin, and from there fly to West Germany. Between 1949 and 1961, over 3 million people fled East Germany, nearly 20% of the entire population. This was a disaster for East Germany. The people leaving weren't just anyone. They were the educated, the skilled, the young. Doctors, engineers, teachers, scientists. The best and brightest were abandoning the communist paradise for opportunities in the West. The East German economy was bleeding talent. Something had to be done. On the night of August 12 and 13, 1961, East German authorities sealed the border. Soldiers and police, backed by Soviet troops, began stringing barbed wire across streets. They tore up roads. They blocked subway lines. Overnight, Berlin was cut in 2. Families living on opposite sides of the city were separated. People who worked in one sector but lived in another couldn't get to their jobs. The city was in shock. Over the following weeks and months, the barbed wire was replaced with concrete. The Berlin Wall grew into a sophisticated system of barriers. 2 parallel walls, each 13 feet high, separated by a 160-foot wide death strip filled with guard towers, anti-vehicle trenches, floodlights, and landmines. On the eastern side, buildings along the wall were demolished to create a clear field of fire. The wall eventually stretched 96 miles, completely encircling West Berlin. Escape became nearly impossible. But people tried anyway. They dug tunnels. They jumped from buildings adjacent to the wall. They hid in cars, in secret compartments. They swam rivers. They flew homemade hot air balloons. Some attempts were ingenious. Some were desperate. And many ended in tragedy. At least 140 people were killed trying to cross the Berlin Wall over its 28-year existence, though the real number is probably higher. The wall became the most visible symbol of the Cold War. It represented the Iron Curtain, the division between the free democratic West and the communist totalitarian East. President John F. Kennedy visited West Berlin in 1963 and gave one of the most famous speeches of the Cold War. Speaking to a crowd of over 200,000, he declared, "All free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin. And therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner. I am a Berliner." 24 years later, in 1987, President Ronald Reagan stood at the Brandenburg Gate and issued a challenge directly to Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." At the time, it seemed like an impossible demand. The wall had stood for over a quarter century. The Cold War appeared permanent. Nobody expected the wall to fall any time soon. But by the late 1980s, the Soviet Union was crumbling. Mikhail Gorbachev, who'd become leader in 1985, understood that the old system wasn't working. The Soviet economy was collapsing. The arms race with the United States was bankrupting the nation. Something had to change. Gorbachev introduced two revolutionary policies. Glasnost, meaning openness, which allowed more freedom of speech and press. And perestroika, meaning restructuring, which attempted to reform the economy. More importantly, Gorbachev abandoned the Brezhnev Doctrine, which had stated that the Soviet Union would intervene militarily to preserve communist governments in Eastern Europe. In its place came what was jokingly called the Sinatra Doctrine, after Frank Sinatra's song My Way. Each Soviet satellite state would be allowed to go its own way. The Soviet Union would not use force to keep communist governments in power. This changed everything. Across Eastern Europe, people realized the Soviets might not send in the tanks anymore. In Poland, the Solidarity trade union movement challenged communist rule. In Hungary, the government began dismantling border fences. In Czechoslovakia, people demonstrated for freedom. And in East Germany, pressure built throughout 1989. Starting in September 1989, East Germans began gathering every Monday at the St. Nicholas Church in Leipzig for prayers, then marching through the streets demanding reforms. The Monday demonstrations started small but grew rapidly. On October 9th, over 70,000 people marched. The East German government considered using force to crush the protests. Police and army units were ready. But the order to fire never came. Partially because of Gorbachev's policies. Partially because the regime knew that violence would only make things worse. The protests spread to East Berlin and other cities. Hundreds of thousands of people filled the streets, chanting, "Wir sind das Volk." We are the people. The East German government was losing control. On October 18th, longtime leader Erich Honecker was forced to resign. He was replaced by Egon Krenz, who promised reforms but was viewed with suspicion. The protests continued and intensified. Meanwhile, East Germans were fleeing by the thousands. Hungary had opened its border with Austria in May. East Germans vacationing in Hungary simply walked across the border into Austria and from there to West Germany. The trickle became a flood. By September, thousands were leaving every day. Others took refuge in West German embassies in Prague and Warsaw, demanding to be allowed to emigrate. The embassies became packed with refugees camping in courtyards and gardens. The East German government was in crisis. They had to do something to stem the exodus and calm the protests. On November 9th, the Politburo drafted new travel regulations. East Germans would be allowed to apply for visas to visit West Germany. The regulations were supposed to be announced the next day, November 10th, after border guards had been properly briefed and procedures established. But somebody made a mistake. Gunter Schabowski, the party spokesman, was handed the document at the last minute before the evening press conference. He hadn't been at the Politburo meeting. He hadn't been briefed. He barely had time to scan the paper before facing the cameras. Near the end of the press conference, at 6:53 p.m., Schabowski announced the new regulations. East Germans would be allowed to cross the border. When asked when this would take effect, Schabowski looked confused. He shuffled through his papers. Then he said those fateful words. "As far as I know, it takes effect immediately, without delay." He was wrong. The regulations were supposed to start the next day, November 10th, and only for those who applied for and received visas. But Schabowski had just told the world that the border was open now. Immediately. Western media, monitoring the press conference, seized on this. Within minutes, news broadcasts across West Germany were announcing that the wall was open. Radio and television in East Germany picked up the story. Word spread like wildfire. The border is open. You can cross. Right now. Thousands of East Berliners rushed to the checkpoints. They arrived at Bornholmer Strasse, at Checkpoint Charlie, at every crossing point between East and West Berlin. The border guards were overwhelmed and confused. They'd received no orders about opening the border. They called their superiors, who didn't know what to do. The crowds kept growing. People were shouting, chanting, demanding to be let through. At Bornholmer Strasse, the crowd swelled to thousands. Border Guard Commander Harald Jäger was in an impossible position. His orders said to keep the border closed. But he had thousands of angry people in front of him and no reinforcements. If he used force, people would die. And the world was watching. At 11:30 p.m., Jäger made a decision that would change history. He ordered his men to open the gates. No more checks. No more waiting. Anyone who wanted to cross could cross. The flood began. People rushed through the checkpoint, crying, laughing, embracing the West German police on the other side. Within minutes, the other checkpoints opened too. The wall had fallen. West Berliners, hearing the news, rushed to the wall from their side. Thousands gathered at the Brandenburg Gate, at Checkpoint Charlie, at the wall all across the city. People climbed onto the wall, something that would have gotten you shot the day before. They danced on top of the concrete barrier. They sprayed champagne. They sang. They cried. Strangers hugged each other. The party lasted all night. By morning, people were attacking the wall with hammers and pickaxes. Mauerspecht, wall woodpeckers, they were called. They chipped away at the concrete, taking pieces as souvenirs. The East German government made no move to stop them. What could they do? The genie was out of the bottle. The wall had lost its power. Over the following days and weeks, the demolition continued. Official demolition began on June 13, 1990, but by then, people had already torn down large sections. Sections of the wall were sold as souvenirs. Artists painted murals on remaining segments. The East Side Gallery, a mile-long section of wall, became an open-air art gallery covered in paintings celebrating freedom and unity. On October 3, 1990, less than a year after the wall fell, Germany was reunified. The two Germanys became one nation again after 45 years of division. The event was celebrated across the country and around the world. The Berlin Wall, which had stood as the most visible symbol of a divided world, was gone. And with it, the Cold War itself was ending. The fall of the Berlin Wall triggered a cascade of changes across Eastern Europe. Within months, communist governments fell across the Soviet bloc. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, all transitioned away from communism. The Warsaw Pact dissolved. The Soviet Union itself collapsed in December 1991. The world order that had existed since 1945 was swept away. Looking back, it's remarkable how quickly it happened and how peaceful it was. The Monday demonstrations in Leipzig. The crowds at the checkpoints. The opening of the border. The demolition of the wall. Almost no violence. No tanks. No soldiers firing on crowds. The communist regimes, facing massive popular opposition and knowing the Soviets wouldn't back them with force, simply gave up. There were moments when it could have gone differently. If the East German government had ordered troops to fire on protesters in Leipzig on October 9th, thousands could have died. If border guards had used force at the checkpoints on November 9th, the opening might have been delayed or turned violent. If Gorbachev had been willing to use Soviet military power to preserve communist rule, the whole process might have ended in bloodshed. But it didn't. The peaceful revolution succeeded. And the credit goes to the people. The East Germans who demonstrated week after week despite the risks. The border guards who refused to shoot their fellow citizens. the Soviet leaders who chose reform over repression, and the millions of ordinary people across Eastern Europe who decided they'd had enough of communist dictatorship. Today, Berlin is once again a unified city. Remnants of the wall remain as memorials and museums. The East Side Gallery. Checkpoint Charlie, now a tourist attraction. The Berlin Wall Memorial with its preserved section of the Wall and Documentation Center. These sites draw millions of visitors each year, people from around the world coming to see where history happened. For those who lived through it, the fall of the wall remains the defining moment of their lives. Ask anyone who was in Berlin on November 9, 1989, where they were that night. They'll remember. They'll tell you about the crowds, the emotion, the sense that the world was changing before their eyes. The Berlin Wall stood for 28 years, 2 months, and 27 days. It was built to keep people in. It failed. Because in the end, no wall, no matter how high or how fortified, can permanently contain people's desire for freedom. The wall fell not because of military force or diplomatic negotiations. It fell because millions of people decided they wanted it down. And on one November night in 1989, those people got their wish. The night the wall came down was the night the Cold War began to end. It was the night a divided city became one again. It was the night hope defeated fear, freedom defeated tyranny, and people power showed that even the most seemingly permanent barriers can fall when enough people decide they must.